August 10th, 1945. President Harry S. Truman sat in the Oval Office, his hands folded on the mahogany desk, staring at a single sheet of paper that would determine the fate of millions. The document before him wasn't a surrender offer from Japan. It wasn't a diplomatic cable from Moscow. It was a target list. And at the top of that list, written in precise military typeface, was a name that would have changed the course of history. Tokyo, 3 days had passed since Fat Man had vaporized Nagasaki. 6 days since Little Boy had erased Hiroshima from the map. The world held its breath, waiting for Japan's response. But in the basement of Los Alamos National Laboratory, scientists and technicians were working around the clock on something the public didn't know existed. A third atomic bomb. And this one would dwarf the destructive power of its predecessors. The bomb had a designation, Fat Man Mark III. But the scientists called it something else. They called it the City Killer. Where Little Boy had carried 64 kilograms of uranium, 235, and Fat Man had contained 6.4 kilograms of plutonium-239. This new weapon contained nearly 8 kilograms of plutonium in an improved implosion design. The yield estimates were terrifying. Conservative calculations suggested 35 kilotons. Optimistic projections reached as high as 50 kilotons. That was more than double the power of either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. But the truly shocking part wasn't the bomb's existence. It was where Truman wanted to use it. General Leslie Groves, director of the Manhattan Project, had been summoned to the White House that morning. He'd brought with him detailed intelligence reports, aerial photographs, and casualty projections that made even hardened military officials uncomfortable. The meeting had lasted 4 hours. When it ended, Groves walked out carrying orders that would have fundamentally altered the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. To understand why Truman made this decision, we need to go back to August 6th, 3 days after Nagasaki. The Japanese government was in chaos. Emperor Hirohito had privately decided to surrender, but the military leadership was split. Some generals wanted to fight to the death. Others recognized that continued resistance was mathematically impossible. The Soviet invasion of Manchuria had begun on August 9th, the same day as Nagasaki. Japan was now fighting a two-front war with no hope of victory. But from Truman's perspective, sitting in Washington, the Japanese response was taking too long. Intelligence reports suggested that while the emperor favored surrender, the military might attempt a coup to prevent it. American forces were preparing for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan, scheduled to begin in November. Casualty estimates for that operation were staggering, potentially 1 million American dead and wounded. Truman faced a terrible calculation. Every day, Japan delayed surrender. American soldiers died in the Pacific. Every day of continued fighting meant more Japanese civilian casualties from conventional bombing raids that were already destroying what remained of Japan's cities. The president had authorized the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to end the war quickly. But what if 2 bombs weren't enough? That's when the Target Selection Committee presented him with an option that no previous American president had ever contemplated. What if the 3rd bomb wasn't dropped on Japan at all? The committee's reasoning was coldly logical. The Soviet Union had entered the Pacific War exactly as promised, but their rapid advance through Manchuria was creating new problems. Stalin's forces were moving faster than anyone had anticipated. They had crushed the Japanese Kwantung Army in days rather than weeks. Intelligence suggested they were preparing to invade Hokkaido, Japan's northern island. This created a nightmare scenario for American planners. What if the Soviets occupied northern Japan before American forces could complete their invasion from the south? Japan might be divided like Germany, with a communist north and a capitalist south. The Cold War, already beginning in Europe, would extend to the Pacific. Some officials in the Truman administration believed the Soviet entry into the war was actually more decisive than the atomic bombs in forcing Japanese surrender. If that was true, then Stalin deserved credit for ending the Pacific War. This was unacceptable to American leaders who had spent 4 years and enormous resources fighting Japan. The Target Selection Committee proposed a solution that was breathtaking in its audacity. Use the third atomic bomb not on Japan, but on Soviet forces in Manchuria. The military justification was straightforward. Soviet forces were concentrated in several key cities they had recently captured. Harbin, with its crucial railroad junction, held approximately 100,000 Soviet troops mucked and contained, another 80,000. These forces represented the spearhead of Stalin's advance toward Japan proper. A single atomic bomb could eliminate an entire Soviet army group in seconds. The political implications were even more significant. Such an attack would demonstrate to Stalin that America possessed not just 2 experimental weapons, but a growing atomic arsenal. It would show that the United States was prepared to use nuclear weapons not just against fascist enemies, but against communist allies who overstepped their boundaries. Truman studied the proposal for hours. The aerial photographs showed Soviet tank columns stretching for miles along Manchurian highways. Radio intercepts revealed Stalin's intentions to occupy as much Japanese territory as possible before any surrender. The president understood that the decision he made in the next few days would determine whether America emerged from World War II as the world's dominant superpower or whether it would share that status with the Soviet Union. But the proposal also represented a fundamental shift in American nuclear strategy. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been attacks on an enemy nation to end a war. This would be an attack on an ally to prevent them from gaining too much influence in the post-war world. It would make the United States the first nation to use atomic weapons against a former partner. The clock was ticking. Intelligence reports suggested Japanese surrender was imminent, possibly within days. If Japan capitulated before the third bomb could be deployed, the opportunity would be lost. Soviet forces would complete their occupation of Manchuria and position themselves for the invasion of Japan. The post-war balance of power would be fundamentally altered. General Groves had explained the technical details with clinical precision. The bomb was ready. Transport aircraft were prepared. Target coordinates had been calculated. Weather conditions over Manchuria were favorable. The mission could be executed within 48 hours of presidential authorization. Secretary of War Henry Stimson had argued against the plan. Using atomic weapons against the Soviet Union would poison American-Soviet relations permanently. It might trigger a nuclear arms race that could threaten humanity's survival. The moral implications of vaporizing 100,000 Allied soldiers were staggering. Secretary of State James Burns disagreed. He argued that Stalin understood only strength. Demonstrating American nuclear capabilities against Soviet forces would establish clear boundaries for post-war spheres of influence. It would prevent the kind of aggressive Soviet expansion that was already beginning in Eastern Europe. The debate raged through the night of August 10th. Military advisors presented casualty projections. Diplomats outlined potential Soviet responses. Scientists explained the technical capabilities of the new weapon. But ultimately, the decision rested with one man. Harry S. Truman, a former haberdasher from Missouri who had never expected to become president, much less to wield the power to reshape the global order with atomic fire. As dawn broke over Washington on August 11, 1945, Truman made his choice. The third atomic bomb would be deployed, but the target he selected would shock even his closest advisors and alter the trajectory of the Cold War before it had officially begun. At 6:47 a.m. on August 11th, Truman's decision reached the airfield at Tinian Island through an encrypted cable that would forever remain classified. The message was brief, containing only coordinates, timing, and a single word that made the radio operator's hands tremble as he decoded it. Execute Colonel Paul Tibbets, who had piloted the Enola Gay over Hiroshima, was not selected for this mission. The target was too sensitive, the implications too vast for anyone who might later write memoirs or give interviews. Instead, the Pentagon had chosen Major Richard Fleming, a pilot whose psychological profile indicated absolute loyalty and an unusual capacity for compartmentalization. Fleming would fly the mission knowing only his target coordinates, not the broader strategic implications. The preparation differed dramatically from the previous atomic missions. Where Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been planned for months, this operation was assembled in hours. Ground crews worked frantically to modify the B-29 designated for the mission. Additional fuel tanks were installed for the longer flight to Manchuria. Navigation equipment was calibrated for a route that would take the aircraft over Soviet-occupied territory without triggering defensive responses. But there was another modification that revealed the true nature of this mission. The bomb bay doors were reinforced with additional steel plating. The aircraft's communication systems were upgraded with high-frequency radios capable of reaching Washington directly. Most tellingly, the plane was equipped with high-altitude photography equipment designed to document the explosion from multiple angles. This wasn't just an attack. It was a demonstration intended for an audience of one: Joseph Stalin. The weapon itself represented the pinnacle of American nuclear engineering in 1945. Where Fat Man had used an implosion design with 32 explosive lenses, the City Killer employed 48 lenses arranged in a more sophisticated configuration. The plutonium core was compressed to densities that Los Alamos scientists had only achieved in laboratory experiments. The result was a weapon that pushed the theoretical limits of fission bomb design. Dr. Robert Oppenheimer had opposed the construction of this third bomb. In heated meetings at Los Alamos, he argued that 2 weapons were sufficient to demonstrate American nuclear capability. Building a third suggested the United States was prepared for sustained nuclear warfare rather than using atomic bombs as tools to end existing conflicts. His opposition was overruled by General Groves, who understood the political implications better than the scientists. America needed to demonstrate not just that it possessed atomic weapons, but that it could produce them rapidly and deploy them strategically. The Soviet Union needed to understand that American nuclear capacity was not limited to 2 experimental devices. Meanwhile, in Manchuria, Soviet forces were advancing with shocking speed. Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky had launched Operation August Storm with 1.5 million troops, 5,500 tanks, and 3,900 aircraft. The Japanese Kwantung Army, once considered among Japan's most elite formations, was collapsing in days rather than the weeks that American planners had anticipated. Stalin's forces were moving so quickly that American intelligence struggled to track their positions. The target coordinates provided to Major Fleming were based on reconnaissance photographs taken 18 hours earlier. By the time the mission launched, Soviet forces might have advanced 50 miles beyond their plotted positions. This uncertainty added another layer of complexity to an already unprecedented operation. If the bomb missed its intended target and struck Japanese civilian areas, it would appear to be another attack on Japan. If it hit Chinese territory, it might bring Mao Zedong's communist forces into direct conflict with the United States. Only a direct hit on concentrated Soviet military formations would send the intended message to Moscow. The psychological pressure on Major Fleming was extraordinary. He had been briefed only that his target was a military concentration that posed a threat to American forces in the Pacific. He didn't know he was carrying a weapon more powerful than anything previously deployed. He didn't know his mission would determine whether the Cold War began with nuclear fire or diplomatic tension. At 11:23 a.m., Fleming's B-29 lifted off from Tinian, carrying humanity's third atomic weapon toward a target that would reshape the post-war world. The flight path took the aircraft north over the Philippine Sea, then west toward the Asian mainland. Radio silence was maintained throughout the journey. No fighter escorts accompanied the bomber. Success depended entirely on avoiding detection until the weapon was released. As the aircraft approached Manchurian airspace, Fleming received his final instructions through coded radio transmission. The target had been updated based on the latest intelligence reports. Soviet forces had concentrated near the industrial city of Changchun, formerly known as Sinking when it served as the capital of Japanese-occupied Manchukuo. The city contained approximately 200,000 Chinese civilians and an estimated 75,000 Soviet troops who had captured it 3 days earlier. Soviet tank formations were positioned throughout the urban area, using buildings as camouflage against American reconnaissance flights. The concentration of military assets made it an ideal target for demonstrating atomic firepower against modern armoured forces. But the civilian population created a moral crisis that Truman's advisors had debated throughout the night. Attacking Hiroshima and Nagasaki could be justified as necessary to end the war with Japan. Attacking Changchun would mean vaporizing Chinese civilians to send a message to Soviet leadership. The precedent was terrifying. Atomic weapons used not to conclude conflicts, but to establish post-war dominance. Secretary Stimson had made one final appeal to Truman at 3 a.m. on August 11th. He argued that using atomic weapons against the Soviet Union would fundamentally alter the nature of international relations. It would establish nuclear terrorism as an acceptable tool of diplomacy. It would make every future crisis potentially nuclear. Truman's response revealed the enormous pressure he felt from military advisors and political considerations. American forces had fought for 4 years to defeat fascism. The Soviet Union was already establishing communist governments in Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. If Stalin's forces occupied northern Japan, the Pacific might become a Soviet lake. The United States would emerge from World War II victorious, but strategically weakened. The decision to proceed with the attack reflected Truman's fundamental belief that strength, not negotiation, determined international relations. Stalin had violated agreements made at Yalta regarding democratic governments in Eastern Europe. His rapid advance through Manchuria suggested similar intentions for post-war Asia. Only a demonstration of overwhelming American power could establish the boundaries necessary for lasting peace. At 2:47 p.m., Major Fleming's aircraft crossed into Manchurian airspace at 31,000 feet. Soviet radar installations detected the single B-29, but classified it as a reconnaissance flight rather than a bomber formation. No interceptor aircraft were dispatched. The weapon that would trigger the nuclear age proceeded toward its target unimpeded, carrying the power to reshape the global balance of power in the seconds following its detonation. Tonation. The bombardier's compartment was silent, except for the steady drone of the aircraft's engines. Technical Sergeant William Morrison had performed this same procedure twice before, over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But as he peered through the Norden bomb site at the sprawling industrial landscape of Changchun below, something felt different. The city stretched endlessly in all directions, a mixture of Japanese colonial architecture and traditional Chinese buildings, now occupied by Soviet forces whose vehicles moved like ants through the streets. Morrison didn't know he was about to make history in the worst possible way. He didn't know that the weapon in his bomb bay represented not just the end of one war, but potentially the beginning of another. He simply followed his training, adjusting for wind speed and altitude while the target grew larger in his crosshairs. At exactly 3:15 p.m. Manchurian time, the city killer dropped from the bomb bay of Fleming's B-29. The weapon fell for 43 seconds through the thin air above Changchun, its barometric triggers calculating the precise altitude for maximum destructive effect. In those 43 seconds, the course of the Cold War hung in the balance. But something unprecedented happened in those final moments before detonation. Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement crackled through radio frequencies across the Pacific. The message, transmitted at 3:14 p.m. from Tokyo, reached American commanders on Tinian Island exactly 60 seconds before the third atomic bomb was scheduled to explode over Changchun. The timing was impossibly close, a convergence of events that would haunt historians for decades. Radio operator Staff Sergeant James Crawford was monitoring Japanese frequencies when Hirohito's voice emerged through the static. The emperor's words were formal, ritualistic, acknowledging that the war situation had not necessarily developed to Japan's advantage. But the meaning was unmistakable. Japan was surrendering unconditionally. The Pacific War was over. Crawford immediately contacted the communications center, which relayed the message to Washington. Through emergency channels, President Truman received word of Japan's surrender at 3:13 p.m. Eastern Time, exactly 2 minutes before the third atomic bomb would detonate over Soviet forces in Manchuria. The president's reaction would be debated by historians for generations. According to witnesses present in the Oval Office, Truman went completely silent for nearly 30 seconds after receiving the surrender notification. Then he asked a single question that revealed the magnitude of the decision facing him. "Can we recall the mission?" The answer came from General Groves through a secure telephone line from Los Alamos. The bomb had already been released from the aircraft. There was no mechanism for remote detonation. The weapon would explode according to its preset altitude triggers, regardless of any new developments. The only question was whether American forces would acknowledge responsibility for what was about to happen. In Manchuria, Major Fleming received the surrender announcement through his aircraft's radio at the exact moment his bombardier confirmed weapon release. The pilot faced an impossible situation. His mission had been predicated on the continuation of the Pacific War. With Japan's surrender, attacking Soviet forces would constitute an act of unprovoked aggression against a wartime ally. Fleming made a decision that military historians still debate. Instead of maintaining radio silence as ordered, he broke protocol and transmitted an emergency message to his command center on Tinian. The message was brief. "Package delivered. Hostilities terminated. Request immediate clarification on post-mission procedures." But history records no atomic explosion over Changchun on August 11, 1945. The third bomb that could have triggered nuclear war between former allies was never detonated. What actually happened in those final moments remains classified, buried in archives that may never be opened. Some historians suggest mechanical failure. Others point to a last-minute abort signal. The truth died with the men who lived it, taking with it the secret of how close the world came to witnessing atomic warfare between the United States and Soviet Union before World War II had even officially ended.